Just give it a moment or so here while our attendees enter into the room. All right. Okay, so welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Keith Spencer, and I'm one of our career experts here at FlexJobs. And FlexJobs, for those of you who don't know, has been the most trusted and leading site for remote job listings since 2007. We are thrilled to have as our guest today, Tracy DeFreitas from the Job Accommodation Network to discuss requesting and negotiating workplace accommodations. Before we dive into Tracy's presentation, I am going to cover a few housekeeping items. This will be a 60-minute webinar with a presentation from Tracy, followed by an audience Q&A. Our session today is being recorded, and then the recording will be emailed out to everyone later this week. If you have a question that you would like to ask Tracy, please make sure to type it into the Q&A section rather than the chat section. And you can also use the thumbs up button in the Q&A section to vote up any other questions that you'd also like to hear the answer to, so that we know which questions are most popular and can prioritize answering them accordingly. We likely won't be able to get to every question today, but we are confident you'll learn something helpful. So with all of that out of the way, I will now turn things over to Tracy. Welcome, Tracy, and thank you for joining us.
All right. Thank you so much, Keith, and welcome everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today. Our topic for today is requesting workplace accommodations, and we're going to get into the ins and outs of that. Keith, you can go to the next slide. So this training on requesting workplace accommodations, it will include practical guidance on the accommodation process, including how to request job accommodations under Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that applies in the United States, of course. It will also include key JAN services and resources that will be highlighted. So we'll start now with a quick introduction on the next slide to the JAN service. The Job Accommodation Network, or JAN, is a direct assistance service of the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy, or ODEP. And we've been serving or helping people, employers, individuals with disabilities with accommodation information since 1983. So we have been around for quite some time. JAN offers free, expert, and confidential guidance on workplace accommodations to support people with disabilities or health conditions in achieving their best work. We know at JAN that job accommodations play a very vital role in increasing employment opportunities for people with disabilities, and that's what we're all about. So for over 40 years, we have helped employers and others across the United States recognize the valuable contributions that qualified workers with disabilities add to the workforce. And we do that by providing practical accommodation solutions, strategies for navigating the accommodation process, and then also trusted technical assistance on those Title I provisions of the ADA. The technical assistance that JAN provides is not legal advice, and it is based on enforcement guidance provided by the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or the EEOC. Now, JAN is based in West Virginia, in Morgantown, West Virginia, at West Virginia University. And we're staffed by a small team, including about 14 experienced consultants. We have about 30 people, I would say. Just generally, we're kind of a small little organization inside a larger institution. And at JAN, we're committed to increasing employment opportunities for people with disabilities through effective, tailored accommodation solutions. So again, that's really what we're all about, is trying to come up with accommodation ideas that can help employers and individuals and really kind of achieve those effective employment outcomes. All right, next slide. Now, if you're seeking information on accommodations, all you really need to remember is ask JAN, because we can help. JAN is a trusted partner in the accommodation process. We offer personalized expert guidance every step of the way, whether someone is applying for a job or just onboarding, or maybe they've been employed for many, many years. We're here when you need us and how you need us. Our experienced consultants provide tailored guidance, helping employers, people with disabilities, and others find practical accommodation solutions based on job requirements, specific tasks, functional limitations, and the work environment. So we have to take all of that into consideration. We also provide personalized strategies for effectively navigating the accommodation process, and that's the collaborative dialogue that leads to reasonable workplace accommodations. And we're going to learn more about that in just a little bit. Now, with experience supporting hundreds of thousands of JAN users and responding to around 45,000 inquiries each year, JAN does deliver informed, practical guidance that really meets people wherever they are in the accommodation process. Next slide. Now, JAN consultants are experienced thought leaders who specialize in workplace accommodations and disability-related employment laws. Their expertise covers a wide range of health conditions and functional limitations, whether it be cognitive, neurological, motor mobility, sensory, or immunological. Our team provides guidance on the ADA and Section 501 of the Rehab Act as it relates to agencies of the federal government and related laws. We also have a dedicated specialist who supports individuals with disabilities in exploring self-employment and entrepreneurship too. So that's a separate little project that we offer. All right, next slide. Now, while JAN is available to everyone, most of our inquiries, about 53%, come from employers and professionals who support them. So that might be HR, human resources professionals, EEO specialists, accommodation coordinators, benefits managers, and supervisors and managers. These employers include private businesses of all sizes, as well as federal, state, and local government agencies. So any kind of employer can contact us. Over 90% of the contacts involve accommodations that support job retention, so helping employees stay at or return to work in some way. And we assist employers by providing practical accommodation ideas, guidance on the ADA and related laws, support for navigating the accommodation process. And then we also provide referrals to helpful tools, technology, and services to support the accommodation process. I do want to note JAN does not offer legal advice or enforcement, but we're here to guide you through the accommodation process. If you need more information about how we help employers, you can visit askjan.org. That's ASKJAN.org. And we have an employers page that includes information of relevance to employers. As an individual, you can certainly direct your employer to us for information because that could be helpful. It's a tool or a resource that you can offer to the employer to learn more about accommodations. Next slide. Now, services for individuals with disabilities or family members or advocates, we do, again, assist everyone. Around 40% of JAN's contacts come from people with disabilities. We also assist family members, advocates, professionals such as rehabilitation, medical, or educational professionals who might be supporting individuals in the employment context. We offer to individuals information on how to request and negotiate accommodations, possible accommodation solutions that they could explore with their employer, and then basic guidance on the ADA and their employment rights. We do not offer advocacy or job placement assistance, but we can refer you to other resources that can help with that type of assistance. So for more information on how we serve individuals, again, you can go to askjan.org and check out the individuals page. Next slide. Now, when you contact JAN, getting help is pretty simple and convenient. You can reach us in a number of ways. We have email options, we have a chat option, and then we also have a toll-free phone option. Your first point of contact is going to be a program assistant who will gather some details related to your contact, like your name and some other demographic information. They'll also try to get a better understanding of what sort of information you're looking for so that they can direct your inquiry to the most relevant specialist who can provide the most appropriate assistance based on your questions. So that information, like, what is your question? Are you asking for accommodation information? What sort of disability or limitations are involved? That is all going to help the program assistant direct you to an appropriate consultant. Now, we offer personalized, quick assistance at the time of contact or typically within 24 hours. And our goal, again, is to provide you the support you need when you need it. When you contact Jan for individuals, we would encourage you to use the contact page on our website for the form to send in an inquiry. You can email us directly, or you can use the chat at askjan.org if you'd like. Next slide. Now, at askjan.org, it's a great go-to resource for information on accommodations and the ADA. It's just a good place to start exploring options. From the homepage, you can access a lot of information. I've already mentioned the pages by role, so employers and individuals. We have an A to Z list that organizes information by disability, limitation, job-related function, etc. And then we have our Situations and Solutions Finder, which offers real accommodation scenarios, as well as a number of other quick-to-find links and information right there on the homepage. So you do want to kind of just explore that a little bit to find some information. I am going to talk a little bit about these resources here in just a little bit. But first, on the next slide, let's get started talking a bit about the ADA and requesting accommodations. So the ADA is a federal civil rights law that removes barriers to equal employment for individuals with disabilities who are qualified. Now, Jan's focus is on Title I of the ADA, which sets the foundation for non-discrimination and reasonable accommodation in the workplace. This law, it prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability and requires reasonable accommodation for workers with disabilities unless an undue hardship would result for the employer. These are the basic premises of the ADA. The law was amended back in 2008, and it's known as the ADA Amendments Act, and it generally broadened the interpretation of the definition of disability under the law, meaning who could be covered because they have a disability. And the ADA is enforced by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which I mentioned earlier. They are the agency that accepts complaints if it's necessary to file one. Next slide. Now, I mentioned reasonable accommodation, but what is that? A reasonable accommodation is a modification or an adjustment to a job, the work environment, or the way things are usually done that enables a qualified individual with a disability to enjoy an equal employment opportunity, whether that is an individual applying for a job or an individual who is currently working. Now, the ADA requires reasonable accommodation for people with disabilities who need them during the hiring process, or to perform the essential job duties, or to access equal benefits and privileges of employment. Accommodations come in a lot of different times during your employment and can apply, and the ADA applies throughout the employment life cycle. Now, reasonable means feasible or plausible. So think of it as, is the accommodation possible to provide without it creating an undue hardship for the employer? An undue hardship is any action requiring significant difficulty or expense. And undue hardship really is a very high threshold. It can be very difficult for employers to claim undue hardship when it comes to providing accommodations. Now, also, an accommodation must be effective, meaning that it enables the applicant to compete or an employee to perform their essential job duties. So it must work. It must enable that person to do what's necessary when their disability causes some limitations. Now, you can refer to the EEOC's enforcement guidance on reasonable accommodation and undue hardship under the ADA for more information, and that's linked here. It's a great go-to resource on this topic. Next slide. Now let's talk about some common accommodations. There is no comprehensive or exhaustive list of job accommodations that can be requested in the workplace, but some common accommodations listed on this slide include making existing facilities accessible and usable. It could be job restructuring, where we change when or how certain functions are performed. It could be flexible and modified work schedules. That's pretty common. It could be modifying policies. So those might be policies related to attendance. It could be related to dress codes in the workplace. It could be related to where work is performed, like telework or working from home. It could also be acquiring or modifying equipment, so assistive technology, for example, that might be needed by a person with a disability to perform certain tasks in the workplace. It can also be services like a qualified reader or interpreter or a job coach that might enable somebody or assist somebody on the job in terms of learning the job tasks. It could also be access for a service or emotional support animal in the workplace. And then other options could be reassignment when we find that there are no accommodations in the person's original position that would enable them to perform the essential job duties. And leave might be needed in some instances where someone needs a little bit of time to manage their health condition. Now, remember, accommodations are never one size fits all, so it really is necessary to explore and consider accommodations on a case by case basis, no matter what the situation is. Next slide. Now, when is a reasonable accommodation required in the workplace? Well, when an individual with a disability indicates that they're having some difficulty in the hiring process or performing their job duties due to limitations associated with a health condition or a disability, that's when the employer should consider whether the person is requesting a reasonable accommodation. Now, an accommodation request, it typically includes information that would equate to a disability disclosure and typically a mention of a work-related barrier. An accommodation request made based on a disability or a health condition or limitations, it does trigger an employer's responsibility to initiate that accommodation process under the ADA. So on the next slide, what is this? Well, anytime an employee indicates that they need a work-related adjustment due to a health condition for a medical reason, for example, then the employer should consider whether the employee is making a request for accommodation. Often there's not really a clear sign indicating that the ADA is triggered, but when there is that sort of connection or that nexus between a health condition, a disability, or limitations and restrictions, and a work-related issue, it's typically time to engage in the accommodation process under the ADA. So here on this slide, we have some examples. So for example, if someone were to say, I'm neurodiverse and I need interview questions in advance, or I'm having difficulty concentrating because of the side effects of medication, or maybe someone mentions their wheelchair won't fit under their desk, or it could be a healthcare provider's note that requests leave for medical treatment, or maybe someone says they need to go to counseling appointments and they want to flex their schedule. So these are just examples, but what you'll see here is in most of these, there's some sort of connection to a disability, health condition, and a work-related barrier of some sort. So when we have that, that's generally when it's a request for accommodation. Now, Jan offers a lot of resources and some on this slide that you may want to check into. One is requesting and negotiating a reasonable accommodation. That's for individuals. And then for employers, recognizing an accommodation request helps us figure out when someone is requesting an accommodation. So you can check those out. Next slide. Now, an accommodation request, it may be made either by the applicant, an employee, or a family member. It could come from a healthcare professional or some other representative acting on the individual's behalf, like a vocational rehabilitation counselor, for example. We know too that accommodation requests may be verbal or documented, and there's no specific word or words or terms that are required to be used when we're requesting an accommodation. Also, an accommodation need not be made at a certain time. So for example, it may be made after hiring, even if it wasn't requested during the application process, or it may be made after performance problems have arisen. But keep in mind that an employer is not required to forego or rescind any consequences for what has already occurred. So while we can request accommodations after performance problems occur, it doesn't erase what has already happened. Next slide. Now, generally, the individual with a disability is responsible for informing the employer that an accommodation is needed. Employers are not expected to guess that we need an accommodation. So, this means that the onus falls on the employee or the individual to make that accommodation request and disclose a disability when it's necessary. They typically go hand in hand. Remember, I mentioned, a request can be stated or written. It can be in plain language and need not mention the ADA or say reasonable accommodation, though it is suggested. So if you're going to request accommodation, it's important to be as clear as possible. And a request for accommodation typically includes disability disclosure, which on the next slide is the act of sharing personal information about a health condition or a disability. And it's usually meant to request an accommodation needed to participate in various aspects of employment. So what we have typically is that disclosure. The reason someone is disclosing is because they're saying, I need something at work because of my disability. But keep in mind, disclosure is voluntary. It's a decision that is very personal. But it may be necessary in order to receive an accommodation because an employer has a right to know why or whether a person requesting an accommodation has a disability in order to determine their right to receive an accommodation. So, this is why it may be important to make that disclosure. Now, Jan offers a lot of detailed information on disability disclosure, and you can find that information in our A to Z by topic on disability disclosure. So there's some really good information there about rights, responsibilities, and just some tips to consider. Let's go to the next slide, and I just want to kind of cover some tips to keep in mind when we're disclosing a disability. The first is not to disclose too soon. So some people with non-obvious or non-apparent disabilities, they might feel as though they're not being completely honest with an employer if they don't tell them everything about their disability up front at the time of interview or hiring. But ultimately, the disclosing really is about letting the employer know you need accommodation. So if you don't need accommodations, it's not necessary to disclose information about your disability. And if you do decide that you need to request accommodations, then you can provide or start with some basic information about your health condition, your limitations, and what accommodations you may need, and keep it brief to start with. Next, we don't want to disclose too late. So the timing of a disclosure is significant. We don't want to wait to disclose a disability and to request accommodations until performance is suffering, right? So I just mentioned that a couple minutes ago. We do want to try to keep that from happening. So if you know that your disability is affecting your ability to do your job, let's have a conversation with the employer about it before we get too far into a performance discussion. So don't wait till it's too late. Another tip, disclose to someone who can act on the request for accommodation. So this is going to be someone in human resources, maybe a supervisor, a manager. Some employers have their own in-house policies and procedures that detail how they handle accommodation requests, and you can check in with your employer to figure that out. But oftentimes you could start with a manager or supervisor, or you could start with human resources. That's a pretty safe bet. And finally, don't disclose to everyone. Remember that you have the right to keep your information about your disability private. It's not necessary to inform coworkers or colleagues about your disability or your need for accommodation. So you can keep that private. The ADA requires the employer to keep your disability and medical information confidential and to only give it to managers and supervisors on a need-to-know basis. So you can certainly be more private about that and only share it with those who are on a need-to-know basis. Next slide. Now let's talk about some strategies for making an accommodation request. Well, first, you really want to consider how you'll make the request. So it's important to choose the communication method that makes the employee, feel most comfortable and aligns with the workplace culture. Common options include face-to-face meetings, email, or formal letters. Texting may not be the best method. Some workplaces are casual and they do allow that. We probably wouldn't recommend it, but sometimes that does happen. A written request, like an email or a letter, creates a clear record of the request, and this can be helpful for tracking and follow up. So we would say that that's probably a good way to request an accommodation. But of course, in some cases, an informal conversation with a manager might be enough to start the process. So you could start there, consider the nature of the relationship you have with your manager and whether you're comfortable. That might dictate what you feel as though is the right way to request the accommodation for you. So it's very personal. Jan does offer resources to support employees with disabilities in requesting an accommodation. You can check out the how to request an accommodation, and it includes just sort of a template that can help you. And then we also offer sample language for accommodation request letters that gives you some ideas of things to consider. So let's take a look at a sample request on the next slide. Here, keep in mind, there are no official forms for making a request for accommodation under the ADA, but some employers, they do have their own forms for documenting accommodation, so you do want to check in with your employer. And it's possible that if you didn't document it, they're going to ask you to document it. On this slide is an example of an accommodation request related to a mental health condition. This comes from the Jan sample language resource that I mentioned a moment ago, and it's available to anyone. It lays out a simple yet effective request, I think. The letter is very brief, but it does make clear for the employer that the person is requesting accommodations due to medical issues that are affecting their mood and their sleep schedule, their concentration, and their focus. And then they go on to mention that workplace distractions are interfering with concentration, and that they'd like to try noise canceling headphones and having a to-do list to keep track of their work. So this request, it includes some of the most essential elements of a clear request for accommodation. We have the limitations, the health-related needs. It specifies that it is a request for accommodation. It notes some work-related barriers and the impact of limitations on job performance, and it offers specific accommodation ideas. So you can see it doesn't have to be complicated. This is pretty brief, but it really hits all of those really important elements. So this and some other examples can be found in that Jan resource on sample language for accommodation request letters. So do check that out. It may give you a little bit more of a foundation for what could be included in a request for accommodation. Next slide. Now, after choosing a method for making an accommodation request that's right for you, you really do want to consider, who should I ask? Who needs to receive the request to act on it? So we do want to make sure that you're asking the correct person. This could be someone in HR, your supervisor, manager, or a designated ADA coordinator in some organizations or federal agencies. So it just depends on who you're employed with. If you're unsure, again, HR is usually a safe first step. They can direct you to the proper contact within your organization. It's better to ask someone who has the authority to act on your request or who can formally start the accommodation process. So it's not going to be a coworker. It's going to be someone who can act on that request. Knowing who to contact also helps avoid delays and ensures that your request is handled appropriately. So you may want to check into that, maybe even before you make the formal request for accommodation. Next slide. Now, after deciding who to ask about accommodations, you'll want to explain how your health condition affects your ability to perform your job. Let your employer know that you're asking for something because of your health condition, your disability, and or your related limitations. It's not necessary to share every detail of your specific diagnosis, rather just enough information to demonstrate that you have the health condition and an accommodation is necessary. So those are the two important points to really put out there. Now, under the ADA, employers can probably ask for a diagnosis as part of verifying that you have a disability, so know that. However, you can try starting out with more general information and see whether the employer accepts it. So it's okay to start with that basic information. You do want to keep your explanation focused on barriers and limitations affecting your ability to perform the job duties. We don't need a lengthy history of your health condition or anything like that. It's really your opportunity to help the employer understand the connection between your health condition and your need for accommodation. Now on this slide, we have some additional Jan resources that are linked related to the accommodation process and requesting accommodations. We have an employee's practical guide to requesting and negotiating accommodations. And then we have an excellent FAQ that includes basic ADA and accommodation process questions. So I encourage you to check those out. And those can all be found on the individuals page at askjan.org. All right, next slide. Now, when requesting accommodations, while the employee is not required to suggest an accommodation, it's often helpful to start the accommodation conversation by proposing your own ideas. People generally know their own needs best. So if you propose accommodations that have worked for you in the past or that you've researched or suspect will meet your needs, you're going to be off to a good start. You don't have to have all the answers right away, of course, but your suggestions will guide the conversation and help the employer understand what may be effective and feasible. So getting that ball rolling in terms of providing your ideas is really a good place to start. Now, accommodation examples can include flexible work hours, assistive technology, ergonomic equipment. It can be remote work options, but every situation is unique and should be approached case by case. So keep that in mind. What is really important to remember too, though, is to be open to the dialogue. We need to have that collaborative conversation. So the accommodation process is one where both parties work together to find a reasonable solution. So we need to both be part of that solution. And sometimes there can be a breakdown on either side when both parties don't work willingly together in a collaborative way. So just kind of keep in mind that, the more collaborative you can be as the individual making the request for accommodation, the more likely the employer is also going to be collaborative in that. Now, the AskJan.org website features tools to help explore accommodations, such as the A to Z lists and the Situations and Solutions Finder. And again, I'm going to talk about that here in just a few minutes. Next slide. Now, once you've requested accommodations, do know that if it's requested by the employee may need to submit supporting documentation with their accommodation request or promptly afterwards. You could start by not doing that and see what the employer asks for. That's absolutely okay. If it's not obvious that you have a disability or need an accommodation, your employer can ask you to provide limited medical documentation to show that you're covered under the ADA and to help clarify why you need an accommodation. But your employer cannot ask for documentation that's unrelated to determining the existence of a disability and the need for accommodation. So what this means is that in most situations, an employer cannot ask about other medical conditions you might have or request complete medical records. I would say that ultimately, maybe just be prepared to provide reasonable medical information that explains how your condition impacts your job without needing to disclose your full medical history. So we have to make that connection again between the disability and the work-related issues and help the employer understand why are you coming to them asking for an accommodation. It's important to provide the information in a timely manner because if you don't, this could delay the accommodation process. And ultimately, if you're unsure what kind of documentation is needed, ask HR for guidance. They will probably tell you specifically what they're looking for. It's possible the employer will request specific information or for your healthcare provider to complete what they might call an ADA medical inquiry form or something like that. So just kind of be prepared for that. Know that going into this, you might be asked questions about your disability and your need for accommodation. All right, next slide. Now, on the topic of providing medical information, healthcare providers or medical professionals, they do play a key role in providing clear and supportive documentation for accommodation requests. It's not their role to decide what accommodations must be provided, but documentation about the disability, the limitations, and ideas around accommodation can help, and some healthcare providers will assist with that. And they might be providing a general description of the condition. They might include information such as which major life activity is substantially limited by the impairment, what specific limitations the individual is experiencing, and then ultimately how those limitations impact the work in some way. So, a healthcare provider can certainly offer that information. And again, it's not the provider's responsibility to suggest or say what specific accommodations are going to help, but some providers have a familiarity and can certainly offer some input around the accommodations that might be helpful. So it's okay to have that conversation with your healthcare provider and see how they can support you with your request for accommodation. Jan does offer a resource to assist medical professionals in providing sufficient information in support of an accommodation request. So you can refer to that practical guidance for medical professionals providing sufficient medical documentation, which really kind of lays out what you might be asking your healthcare provider to do. And you can even share that with them. It'll help them create the documentation that you need. Next slide. Now, finally, keep communication open during the accommodation process. After requesting an accommodation, if you don't hear back within a reasonable time frame, maybe it's a week or 2 weeks or more, it's okay to send a polite follow-up message to the employer to inquire about your request. Following up, it really shows that you're serious about your request, and it helps the accommodation process keep moving forward. And always keep a record of communications. This is useful if there's any delay or dispute later on in the process, so it's a good idea to document everything. And remember, advocating for yourself is part of the process, and persistence is often necessary. Jan offers a resource to support this follow-up, and you can refer to the Employee Accommodation Inquiry Letter that we have linked here on this slide. Now, in summary, making an accommodation request, it really is a collaborative process. You have the right to ask for support, but presenting your request clearly and professionally makes it easier for everyone. The request, again, is typically what triggers that accommodation process under the ADA. So let's talk about that next so we get an understanding of what that looks like on the next slide. Now, the accommodation process, it is simply an ongoing collaborative dialogue between the employer and the employee. Think of it as an informal process to clarify what the individual needs and identify the appropriate reasonable accommodations. When an accommodation is not obvious, an appropriate accommodation is best determined through a flexible process. And that process typically involves these actions on this next slide here: analyzing the job involved and determining its purpose and essential functions. It could be the employer and the individual consulting to kind of figure out the precise job related limitations involved. And how the accommodations might help the individual overcome those limitations. It could also involve consultation with the individual to be accommodated, identifying potential accommodations and assessing their effectiveness to enable that person to perform the essential job duties. And it's also important for the employer to consider the preference of the individual to be accommodated. Their job is to select and implement the accommodation that's most appropriate for both parties. So there's a lot. It really is this sort of a process where we work together to cover those different areas or different elements of the process. Now, on the next slide is a sample process. Jan does offer a 6-step sample accommodation process that includes practical guidance and tools. Now, please note this is a general example and it may not reflect your organization's preferred process. So before following this, we certainly want to check in and review your organization's formal policies and standard procedures if they have them. Not all employers will have an accommodation process. This particular sample accommodation process framework, it is helpful to employers, but employers are free to develop and implement their own policies and procedures that suit their organization. So that's why you might see yours looking a little differently. Now, each accommodation process is unique, but many do include steps such as recognizing the accommodation request and acting in good faith, can be gathering information to better understand the employee's disability and limitations and accommodation need, and collaboratively exploring, choosing, and implementing accommodations. And finally, monitoring accommodations for effectiveness. Just kind of keep in mind there's no accommodation process or solution that fits every situation, and each process has to begin with a collaborative dialogue. So that's really where we want to start. Now, if you want to know more about what that sample accommodation process looks like and the steps that are involved, you can check out the JAN resources on the accommodation process, and also our workplace accommodation toolkit, which is something you could refer an employer to if they need a bit more guidance on what the accommodation process should look like. Next slide. Now, that process, it involves openly discussing specific aspects of the job that may be difficult and focusing on job functions rather than the health condition. So we do want to start a collaborative dialogue and find solutions together. We need to actively listen to each other, seek common ground, and show mutual respect throughout that process. To start that process, we're going to work together. An employee might often identify specific accommodations that may be needed, but again, both parties are going to work together and can and should suggest possible accommodation solutions. And I think it's important for employers to give employees an opportunity to share relevant information about their disability without getting too detailed about their health condition. But gathering more information may be necessary in order to move forward in the process. Now, that JAN resource I mentioned earlier, that FAQ on basic ADA and accommodation process questions, it really offers a lot of information to support employees when they're engaging in the accommodation process with an employer. So I encourage you to check that out because it will answer a lot of questions that commonly come up for individuals in that process. All right, next slide. Now, as it relates to providing sufficient information to support a request for accommodation, the employee will need to provide enough information, again, to show they have an impairment that substantially limits at least one major life activity, and it explains why accommodation is needed and how it will help. There are some limitations on when and what information employers may request, but if you think your employer is asking for more medical documentation than allowed, then you shouldn't just ignore the request or refuse to provide the information without letting your employer know why you feel that way. So JAN offers ideas about what you might do if you're having trouble providing documentation, or maybe think your employer is asking for too much medical information than is necessary to move forward. So a few resources here. We have a flexible approach to ADA medical documentation, which offers some different ways to go about providing and receiving that documentation. We have dealing with improper requests for medical documentation from an employer to help us when we think they may be asking for too much. And then, of course, the enforcement guidance on reasonable accommodation and undue hardship, which I mentioned earlier. If you refer to questions 6 and 8, you'll understand a bit more about what exactly an employer might request when someone asks for an accommodation, and when maybe they can't ask for that information. So check out questions 6 and 8. All right, next slide. Now, once the employer understands the employee's limitation and the related workplace issue, it's time to explore accommodation options. So as we move forward in the accommodation process, we get to this place where we're going to work together to come up with creative solutions. Typically, this might start by the employer inviting the employee to suggest their ideas. If more information is needed, maybe we get the healthcare provider or other appropriate professionals involved, like vocational rehabilitation counselors or licensed professional counselors who might be working with the individual. So, there can be an accommodation team of people who can offer ideas and information to support that process. Of course, we always want to remember to ensure confidentiality throughout that process. When we're exploring accommodations, we're going to evaluate all potential accommodations and, again, consider employee preference. So if you have a preference, mention it. We want to consider the effectiveness of the accommodations that are proposed. Of course, we can look at feasibility and cost. So in that, we are thinking about sort of the direct impact in terms of the cost of providing accommodation. Although at JAN, we know that most accommodations cost nothing to very little. And an employer can certainly consider the impact on their operations in providing that accommodation. So there's a lot to consider when you're exploring solutions. Next slide. Okay, so When we're exploring accommodations, just some practical guidance to take into consideration. We always want to stay open minded. Accommodations, of course, involve doing things differently to address disability related limitations and work related barriers. We want to be open to all sorts of options and be willing to give them a try. Suggest accommodations if you're the individual. You may have helpful ideas, but you're hesitant to share them. So, coming to the table with your ideas will really support a timely accommodation process. So don't be worried about presenting options that you think could work. And the employer may need to consult with the employee's healthcare provider or other appropriate professionals for input. Again, some providers might be willing to help generate accommodation ideas. Um, but again, it's not their responsibility. And of course, don't hesitate to use the Jan service to help explore accommodation options. It's a free nationwide service specifically designed to help people find accommodation solutions. So certainly take advantage of that. Go to Ask Jan to get started with that. Next slide. Now, the exploration stage of the accommodation process, it really is critical to finding effective solutions. When we're exploring accommodations, employers might ask questions like these on this slide here. So, for example, starting with what specific accommodation do you need? This helps them get some clarity regarding the employee's accommodation needs. They may also need to know how the accommodation will address the person's specific limitations and their ability to perform the essential job duties. And this is important because it connects the request to job performance, which ultimately is really what we're going to focus on. Or what accommodations have you tried in the past that were or were not helpful? This encourages the employee to share any previous experience with accommodations, and it helps the employer learn from previous experiences to tailor that accommodation effectively. As an individual, if you have found that there are certain accommodations that just have not worked for you, that's valuable information that can be helpful to the accommodation process. Next slide. Now, I mentioned that A to Z of disabilities and accommodations earlier. This feature at askjan.org is a great place to start your search for accommodation solutions and ADA information as well. There you can browse for information in a number of ways by disability, limitation, work-related function, topic, and accommodation. And all of the information is laid out a little bit differently, but it just depends on what you're after. So, for example, you'll find common health conditions like diabetes, mental health conditions, vision impairment, or multiple sclerosis, along with related accommodation ideas by disability, and more specifically by limitation. I think that's a good place to start. Now, keep in mind that the A to Z list isn't a comprehensive or comprehensive or a list of ADA disabilities. It really reflects health conditions that Jan frequently discusses with its users. If you don't see a specific health condition represented there, then you might need some personalized assistance, or you might start with those limitations first. And you can contact Jan for guidance. We'll meet you where you are and provide information tailored to your situation. Next slide. Now, another feature for exploring accommodations is the Situations and Solutions Finder at askjan.org. It's an interactive tool that allows you to search a wide range of accommodation types, and these are situated by in various industries or job types. It's a great way to kind of just see what others have done in similar situations. These scenarios are developed from customer feedback that we've received, and it just kind of gives you sort of a real world approach to learning about what accommodations are actually happening out there. So you can search in various ways. There are filters that you can use. You can even copy your search results if you want to share them with someone else. Again, this is not a comprehensive accommodation finder. It provides some helpful ideas, but we always want to make sure that we're looking at accommodations on a case-by-case basis. So use it to explore options, but contact Jan if you need specific assistance regarding an accommodation situation. Next slide. All right, so after we explore accommodation options, the employer may choose the accommodations to implement. So at the end of the day, the employer gets to choose any effective option. This could include the most cost-effective one for the employer. And it is possible for the employer to consider alternative accommodations to what was suggested or requested by the individual. But the key is that they must be effective. So they must enable the person to perform the essential job duties. If you're unsure about accommodations and what will be effective, a trial accommodation is always a great way to help evaluate effectiveness. It can also bridge delays in securing accommodations that might be more permanent long term. So, a trial or short term accommodation is a good practice. And this may just be a place to start if we're not really sure what's going to work. So maybe give the accommodation a try if you've offered something, and you can even suggest this. So if the employer seems a little bit unsure about the accommodation, you might suggest providing it on a temporary or trial basis. Now, once an accommodation is chosen, implementation is key, of course, and this may involve installing equipment or in training the employee. It could be informing managers of a schedule or a policy change. It could be coordinating outside services. So it'll be up to the employer to make sure that they're taking these steps to implement the accommodation. Next slide. Now, what if the employer chooses an accommodation, but you don't believe it's effective? It's important to really have a conversation. So we want to inform the employer that the accommodation isn't effective. It's useful to do this in writing, and you'll want to explain why the alternative accommodation isn't effective, and perhaps ask that whatever the original accommodation was that maybe you suggested be reconsidered if it's reasonable, or ask to explore alternative options. So if something was offered, you're not really sure it's going to work, or you've tried it and it's not working, that accommodation process needs to continue. So we do want to return to that. You can look at the JAN resource on how to inform an employer that an accommodation is not effective. And there's also a sample letter that goes with that for some more information on what to do in those situations. All right, next slide. Now, ideally, the accommodation process will lead to an employer providing an effective accommodation, but sometimes that does not happen. So what if the accommodation request is denied? Well, there are some there are some options to consider if this happens. So if your employer denies your request, try to find out why so you know what to do next. So for example, if your employer denied your request because maybe the medical information didn't show that you have a disability, maybe you can provide some additional information. Or if your employer decided that the accommodation you requested isn't reasonable or will pose an undue hardship, then maybe we want to get back to the table and suggest alternative options. If you don't think your employer had a valid reason to deny your request, or maybe the employer won't tell you why the request was denied, then maybe you could try to appeal the decision by going up the chain of command within your place of employment, or filing an internal grievance if that's an option, or maybe a grievance with a union if that's an option. So you'll really just kind of want to consider what options you have available internally. Another option is you could contact your state protection and advocacy program. They are available to provide legal guidance and advocacy assistance, and they might be able to give you some tips on or support in terms of legal guidance that could help. And then finally, consider whether it's necessary to contact the EEOC or your state Fair Employment Practices Agency to file a formal complaint if you believe that's necessary. It's not the best option, but it is an option if you believe your rights are being violated. So for more information, you can check out JAN's Your Accommodation Request Was Denied, What Now? And it outlines all of these possible options. All right, next slide. Now, while navigating the accommodation process, I think it's really important to keep communication in mind. It really is truly key. So we'd like to offer some effective communication tips for the accommodation process. First of all, we want to collaborate to solve problems and find solutions that benefit everyone. So we don't want to approach the accommodation process in an adversarial way. We really want to assume that everybody wants an effective solution. It's also important to be open and honest and be transparent. It is crucial for effective communication. So share the information that's needed, and also ask questions and expect transparency from the employer as well. We do want to communicate clearly so everyone is on the same page. We do want to avoid misunderstandings. So both parties should be willing to answer questions and provide clarification when it's needed. So be at the ready, able to answer the employer's questions and give the information that's needed. And of course, we want to stay open minded and adaptable and creative because accommodations are never one size fits all. So really kind of work together to find ideas, listen actively, again, seek that common ground and work together. We have found, of course, that when an employee experiences the accommodation process as responsive, empowering, and supportive, that the employee's performance and the entire workplace is likely to benefit from this. So let's try to make it one process that is productive and supportive as much as possible. All right, next slide. So this concludes the training on requesting workplace accommodations. I do hope that this information is helpful. I appreciate everyone for attending. If you do have questions or would like more information or consultation on accommodations, remember that you can ask Jan. For individuals, I do recommend that you use the email option. You can email us at jan@askjan.org or just go right to askjan.org and use the contact page to submit your questions. We also have a live chat option at askjan.org. And then the direct assistance, telephone assistance is available at 800-526-7234 for employers. Individuals can certainly call and leave a message and we'll get back to you via email as well. So that is an option. And on the next slide, if you're not doing so already, do be sure to follow us on social media for updates and resources. You can find us, the Job Accommodation Network on Facebook, LinkedIn, at Jan on X, and of course, check out our Jan Information channel on YouTube. Lots of great trainings there and resources. So thanks again to everyone for attending. A special thanks to Keith and Katie for allowing me to share this information for FlexJobs today. With that, I will turn it over to you, Keith.
Yes, thank you, Tracy. That was fantastic information on a very important topic. So we really appreciate your time here today.
Yeah.
Do have a couple minutes. We'd love to get some questions in here. Our first question, this person is sharing that they're hoping to return to work full time, which will require some accommodations. And they want to know, I know you touched on this already, but I think it bears reiterating, what's kind of the better strategy, negotiating their accommodations while accepting the job offer, or accept the job offer and then request accommodations?
Well, I think it depends. I don't think there's a one way to answer that question because it may depend on the facts of the situation. So, if you know that you are likely to be able to perform the job duties with accommodations, and if you believe that those job accommodations that you need are likely reasonable, then you may be able to go ahead and move forward with accepting the offer and then making your request for accommodation. Because you're going into that situation having a pretty good feeling about what might be possible. So you could consider that. Some people choose to share that they need accommodations before they go to that extent. If that happens, and let's say you haven't accepted the job offer yet, employers are limited in the type of information they can request from you during that stage. So they may not be able to answer your questions so much about what is possible in terms of accommodations because they can't necessarily get a lot of details during that pre-employment process. Like I said, it's not crystal clear one way or the other. You kind of want to weigh what information you have available and what you think is possible.
It's kind of like you referred to, accommodations are not one size fits all. The process of requesting it also not one size fits all.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. So our next one here, kind of a general question, but this person's asking, how can we advocate for ourselves with employers, either to educate them or to reduce, the risk of retaliation, if you were to ask for an accommodation?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it is important in terms of advocating, your goal is going to be helping that employer see the value and talent that you bring to the workplace, right? So you want to ensure that they understand, what you bring to the table, that what you can do, and also how accommodations can benefit you. A lot of times I think people get hung up and they think accommodations are hard. They're really not. A lot of times they're relatively simple and low cost or no cost. So I think helping an employer understand what it means to provide accommodations and specifically for you is a good idea. And if you believe that they may not be skilled or educated on accommodations, send them to Jan. I think what better idea than to say, hey, there's this free resource that's here to help us. And whether you're the individual or the employer, you could certainly send them our way and also direct them to resources that might be of specific relevance to your situation. So you're kind of starting off right away in an informed scenario.
And as you mentioned in your presentation, you have those resources specifically for employers. So that's a really good idea. I love that. Next one here, along similar lines, this person concerned that asking for accommodations could make them a layoff target in the future. They know that this is not legal, but it would be difficult to prove. So do you have any suggestions for how to ask for accommodations without that risk of becoming a target?
That's tricky. I mean, we can't control what employers do sometimes, and sometimes they make the wrong decisions. But I think I kind of go back to the last, question where it's important for you to have what you need to do your best work. So I think if we can approach that again with what do you bring to the table? What value do you add? What are you able to do? And sort of making the point of, I just need these modifications would make a big difference in terms of what I can continue to bring to the table. And trying to kind of, I think, approach the accommodation process as one that isn't too difficult or, again, adversarial or anything like that. We're never going to be able to guarantee that an employer isn't going to retaliate or anything like that. But I think what we can do is try to put our best foot forward and try to approach the process as positively as we can. And safeguard yourself, document it, because if you believe that you're being targeted in some way, you need to be able to have proof of that. So certainly document that you made the accommodation request, just in case there has to be some connection made between that request and the later layoff that occurs.
Yeah, that documentation is a really good piece of advice. And then just one more quick question. Those voluntary disclosure sections on job applications, good idea, bad idea? What are your thoughts on those?
I think we're going to see fewer of those. For years we were seeing that partly because of Section 503 of the Rehab Act, which required federal contractors to go ahead and give people an opportunity to voluntarily disclose for affirmative action reasons. We're going to see a lot of that change, particularly with changes in the federal government administration. So I think you're going to see fewer of those requests on applications. Ultimately, the purpose of those, they were intended to be helpful. The idea of that was to disclose in order to help an employer meet those affirmative action obligations. At the end of the day, it's really up to you. So as an individual, you can decide whether you want to share or not. You certainly have no obligation to. So if you'd rather not, you don't have to. But I do think we're going to see fewer of those moving forward.
Now, if you don't disclose, does that impact your ability to negotiate accommodations later?
It does not.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is we don't want to be untruthful.
Sure.
But typically those voluntary disclosures are simply, yes, I have a disability. No, I don't have a disability, or I wish not to share.
Gotcha.
It's not you saying anything beyond that. If it generally, remember, a disability can occur at any time. You could be hired and 3 days in, you find out that you have a health condition, right? So things do change, but choosing not to answer the question doesn't prevent you from making an accommodation request later.
Wonderful.
And it's for a different purpose. Remember, it really is intended for a different purpose. So.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much for your time, Tracy. This is very valuable information, so we appreciate you sharing this with our audience. Thank you to our attendees for taking the time to join us, and do keep an eye out for your recording email that will come within just a few days. So thank you once again, Tracy. It's been great to have you.
Thanks, Keith. Take care.
All right. Bye, everyone.